thank you all for being here, and thank you to the Wordsworth Trust and everybody involved for welcoming me and letting me wander around and sit in the garden, which I'm enjoying very much. Have a look in the archive, head up over the fells. So I'm having a very good time. And the project you were just referring to, Jeff, is what brought, the other thing that brought me to England. I spent about a week, I guess, till a few days ago, walking the Pilgrim's Way across the North Downs. We started in Dover and made our way along through Shepherd's Well and Chilham and Charing and Hollingbourne and Rougham, which is spelled Rotham. A lot of these names have tripped me up, but it's locally pronounced Rougham. Though the train says Rotham once you pull in, but they have to, spell it phonetically for people who don't know, I suppose. And it was just wonderful. It was there's a group called the Gatwick Detainees Welfare Group. It's a charity here in the UK trying to help out people who have been in detention, immigrants have been in detention. And as some of you may know, the UK is fairly unique in Europe for sure, in not having a time limit on detention of people who arrive, and there's some issue with their papers. Most countries there's a time limit, often very short, a couple weeks, couple months, and a decision has to be made: either let them in or send them back. The UK leave them in limbo completely, and it's incredibly difficult. They lock them up. Sometimes they're in jail for a few months to a few years, and even when they get out of jail, that limbo seems to continue, and they can't work. They can't really travel internally in the UK. They can't do anything. So they have to have a charity even just to keep them alive, because they have no money, of course, either. And every 2 weeks they go get fingerprinted by the government and then let out to hang around again. So they're trying to raise awareness and sort of lobby for some limits on this process so people don't have to live that long and simply not knowing what's going to happen to them. So we walked along for a week with some of these people that have been in detention with us, and some of the activists. They're trying to support them here in the UK. We had it was anywhere from about 80 to 100 people walking every day, and every night there'd be an event based on Chaucer's Canterbury Tales where they had an invited writer would provide a tale based on an interview with someone who had some relationship to the detention process. Either they were a detainee, they used to be a detainee, they're a lawyer working with detainees, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really kind of powerful and amazing, but every night you would hear these heart-rending stories, because generally these people had a terrible time in the country they've come from, and that's continuing. They're not having a great time once they arrive here either. So it's a pretty dreadful situation. Okay, there you go. Wordsworth. Let's talk about Wordsworth. Although it's kind of an interesting few weeks to spend in the UK. 1 week sort of rereading the world through Chaucer, and then the next week I'm spending up here rereading the world yet again through Wordsworth's eyes. So I think part of this is billed as my argument with Wordsworth, and that's probably the least interesting part of what I've got to say, because on the one hand, the argument is with something that any of us, and I'm assuming most of the people here are local, who know a little bit more about Wordsworth. It doesn't really affect us, but that outward perception of Wordsworth simply is I wandered lonely as a cloud, and not much else. To me, one of the least interesting poems there is, but very catchy and memorable. Yes. And I know in Canada, that's a poem that children memorize still. My daughter was in the car with me with her friends. I was driving them all to dance one day recently, and one of them started reciting it off the top of her head. I was like, "Hey, that's Wordsworth." I said, "I'm going to his house." And she said, "Oh, wow, can you ask him?" And she had some questions. Check on Wordsworth, but actually he's not quite alive anymore. So, any writer of a certain stature, sometimes that can happen. There can be a cartoon version of them that sort of travels around the world, and the sort of postage stamp version that's actually often the least interesting part about them, it seems. But the other thing, and again, I think it's very predictable and maybe not all that interesting, is that the younger Wordsworth, writing in the 1790s and into the early 19th century, is the more interesting Wordsworth to me, and the older Wordsworth becomes more and more conservative. Sometimes that happens as we age, and seems less interesting, but in very particular ways for me. That is that the early Wordsworth, the idea of the commons, I think is a very key idea for him. that so many of the poems in 1790s are set on common land. He mentions, I was walking across a common again and again and again. He's on the commons. And that's where he's meeting displaced people and vagrants and things like this. And I think it's metaphorically deeper than that. And I think it's really fused with his idea of what poetry is. Poetry is something to do with the commons. Thus, in the preface to the lyrical ballads, you get all the discussions about common language and the language that common people would use, and his interest in that. And that, early reviewers of that book right away knew this is pretty radical stuff, just to write a poem about a vagrant. So that stuff interests me. And I think the contrast is, as it gets older, poetry ceases to be about the commons in some way and becomes more and more about private property, intellectual property specifically. So, and again, I think probably in this room that's sort of a well-known thing, that Wordsworth was someone who lobbied actually quite hard for indefinite, what's the word I'm looking for? Copyright is the word I'm looking for. Which I think in his era was maybe 14 years, I think was the limit, or is it 7 years still at that point?
It was about 27. But
is it 27? It went up to 27 sometime in his lifetime. He thought it should be indefinite, which even by today's standards, when it's, I think, in Canada anyway, it's like 75 years after the author's death, that seems to me pretty crazy already. Indefinite that's pretty radically conservative around that issue of property. And of course, being able to maintain a home, being able to support himself as a writer were issues throughout Wordsworth's life that he was very concerned about. So in some ways for me, that home at Grasmere, and it's great to be here, that poem celebrating his arrival right there, I love this, you can just gesture at it, it's right there, is really the pivotal moment, because in that poem I find an incredible tension between all sorts of gestures at the commons, literally when he names things as common creativity refers to, and different things like that, but also more conceptually about a sense of unity and connection to place and to people. There's a tension between that idea and the idea of possession, as he says again, it's mine. This is mine, 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 mine. He says about half a dozen times in that poem, doesn't he? And I looked at one of the manuscript drafts in the archive just the other day, and I'm no doubt reading much too much into this, but that's what writers do, don't they? Both times the word common appears in those pages of the draft of Home at Grasmere that I was looking at. Both times the word is broken into two words. And I searched around, I couldn't find many words that he did that with, if it's just an orthographic tick of some kind that he would once in a while split. The only other word I found was beyond, was clearly two words, beyond. Yeah. But both times common in that manuscript is split in two. So I want to read a tension that he's struggling with when he comes to that word, because that feels to me like the poem where he shifts from it's about the common to no, I've got a home and it's mine, and now get out of my yard. Not quite. So if there's a level, and this would go back to that book, Jeff, that you had there, The Commons, that was published in 2008 originally, that picks up a little bit on this kind of an argument, that in some ways there's a branding of Wordsworth and the Lake District when you're outside of this area. If you're talking to other professors or people who might have an interest in Wordsworth in North America, those two things are almost, you can just exchange those two words. Wordsworth, Lakes, Wordsworth. He owns them, it seems. And you suddenly go, oh wait, there are other writers. And we have a wonderful archive at Fraser University in Vancouver where I teach of lakeland literature, especially the guidebooks from the 18th century and early 19th century. And they're beautiful, beautiful books, just in terms of being material objects. But those writers of those guides to the lakes are wonderful writers. I guess you could write a grocery list in the 1780s or 90s and it would be beautiful literature, it seems, but we've lost that somehow. Anyway, they're wonderful, wonderful writers. And I was just kind of blown away that there was this whole chorus of people celebrating the lakes. And in some very similar terms that Wordsworth picked up on and used too. And I was like, oh, so it's not about Wordsworth. It was just like a shared common discourse. I'm skipping over something else I mentioned when I was talking about something I just love that Wordsworth wrote very early on in 1801 in a letter to Charles James Fox, accompanying a copy of Lyrical Ballads. And he says, these poems are written on themes that are the common property of all poets. And it strikes me that he knows exactly, like in legalistic terms, what he means when he's saying common property of all poets. And I think that's just marvelous that that's how he thought of the lyrical ballads. And of course, the era in which he was collaborating with Coleridge and collaborating with Dorothy ultimately and publishing that first edition anyhow, anonymously. There's a real ethos of, I don't own any of this. I'm simply channeling something about human beings' relationship to a particular place in which they are very integrated and in which they belong. Okay. Another thing I love is a letter he writes to Sir George Beaumont in about 1803, I want to say. Is that when that happened? I think it is. I can't find it now. In which Beaumont has given Wordsworth some land near Applethwaite. Is that how we say this? Yes? Right. Good. That way. And I don't know. I want to follow up on this because I can't find anything else written about it. What did Wordsworth do with that land, if anything ever? But he says in the letter, he acknowledges receipt of the deed because Beaumont literally just sends him the deed to the property and says, here it is. You've got the paperwork. And so Wordsworth writes back and says, the writings are in my possession. I mean, the writings meaning the deed to the land. But I just love that there, again, where property and poetry are sort of merging as concepts. I have the writings. And he says, if I'm able to improve the land, great, I will. And he says, I'll pitch my tent on it, and I'll be its steward. So again, I love that the tentative relationship to land. He doesn't really want to own it. He's just going to be a steward and take care of it. He's just going to pitch his tent. And there's a couple great, at least two other times that I know of, Wordsworth uses that metaphor of pitching his tent. He does in Prelude. When he gets out of Cambridge, he decides he's just going to pitch his tent in the common world, or something like that. I'm paraphrasing at that point. And there's also tent pitching somewhere else. Where else does he pitch his tent? Darn, I've lost it now. Somewhere else he also refers to uses that metaphor of pitching his tent. It's just wonderful that that's in part, that could be anxiety about not having stable home in the world, and if anyone has a legitimate reason to have that kind of anxiety, maybe it's Wordsworth. But it also suggests a kind of a sense of a non-controlling, non-owning, non-exclusive relation to the world around him, that he's just going to be passing through tentatively, camping out for a while. Won't be here too long. Don't worry, he won't make a mess. I think he's a very tidy guy. I mean, porridge for 2 meals a day and things like that. I don't know. In that letter, though, to Beaumont, he also refers to improving it, which was a real. And this is where again you find this incredible tension. That was a real word. That word was being used in the late 18th century by all the lobbyists in favor of enclosure of common land. Because the problem with common land was it was being wasted. It wasn't being productively used. And if we enclosed it, privatized it, we still have this ideology very active in the world, right? That we simply need to privatize things and they'll take better care of it than the government ever could. Not always the way. So that's I find that fascinating, again, that this was in every tract supporting parliamentary enclosure, which was rampant, especially in the 1790s. There was a ton of parliamentary enclosure and into the first decade of the 19th century too, that Wordsworth would use a word like that, like improvement. I mean, he would know. That word literally meant to make more profitable. To improve didn't just mean make better. It literally meant to make profitable. So that was fascinating. Again, this idea of productivity and profitability, and yet having a tenuous relationship to it. I'm just pitching my tent and being a steward for a little while. Okay. I need to cover more ground. I'm getting caught up. That was all preface, I think. Oh, well. That seems a Wordsworthian thing to do, though, right? It's all preface and never get to the project. But that's all right. So, as you know, I think writers in the past are kept alive. One way they're kept alive is by writers in the present being interested in them, re-engaging with them and writing through and having kind of conversations with them, little seances with the dead in some way. So I think that's an okay thing to do, probably, that I pick up Wordsworth and I use and abuse him in some ways. I certainly choose a Wordsworth to pull out, right? So I light fire to the daffodil poem, And from its ashes, I choose to raise this more radical Wordsworth, this Wordsworth who called himself a Democrat, which was an incredibly dangerous word in that era to use. More dangerous than the word Republican. And if you can think after the French Revolution, Republican was also a pretty scary word, but Democrat was even scarier than Republican. And these aren't American political terms at all. They don't work in contemporary's landscape at all. But I want to pull that Wordsworth out because I think there's something still fascinating there. And what's really, to me, what's the interesting, quote, radical, quote, democratic idea, it is what Wordsworth has to tell us about our relationship to the natural world. In an era in which we are doing incredible and atrocious damage to the natural world at a scale we have never done before. So we can segue soon to the tar sands. I'll gesture at it just quickly. Today I hiked up and over Silver Howe and down into Langdale, and there's that quarry you can see. And it's quite a noticeable scar on the land, but it's also pretty small. And you can notice in behind it, you can just sort of make out our older quarries from bygone years, which are no longer in use, and they're slowly growing back over. You can basically just see the shape of them, of the sort of terraces that they left behind. But they're all covered in greenery now. So to me, that I look at that and go, that's not so bad. We can sustain that, I think. It's that's slate, is it not? They're taking out of the ground? Well, people are building their houses out of it, and that's good. The difference between that kind of economic use of the natural world, which human beings have always done and we need to do, and the scale of something like the tar sands is literally a scale. So if you were to stand in the middle of the tar sands, it would be pretty much all the Lake District would be gone. Would just be, it's sand. That's an appropriate term. Tar sands refers to the fact that the bitumen, the kind of oil that they have there, is solidified. It's like molasses, or it's even stiffer and more firm than that. And it's filled with grit and sand and bits of rock and things like that. So to extract it, to use it, they have to heat it up. They have to add a liquid gas to it. So they use energy to acquire energy, and they have to clean all the rock and junk out of it. So it's a very expensive process to deal with. But so it's literally comprised of sand, but the fascinating thing I find, and the horrific thing, is once they do extract it, they leave nothing but sand behind. It's literally a desert. And this is very far north. The sun was there in late June, and the sun set for about 3 or 3.5 hours at night and was back up again. So you're quite far north. And all around you is this very damp boreal forest. There's bogs everywhere and little winding streams, and it's very flat and it's a very wet, lush place. And yet they remove everything. They call it the overburden. Everything that's actually occurring in nature is just overburden, as the industry calls it, which they literally just scrape off, and that reveals the layer of bitumen under the soil, and then they mine that up, and then they leave this kind of dirty, sandy landscape behind. So we walked for 10 miles around the circumference of a single, what was a tailings pond, a lake in which they put toxic water that they poisoned with chemicals during the extraction process, then they leave it there to dry for a while, I guess. Because this one was completely evaporated. It was just a 10-mile dry lake of white sand in the middle of the north. So the scale is, and that was just one little corner we were walking in. It goes forever around you. The entire deposit is the size of the UK. Now they've pulled off a chunk that's maybe the size of London so far, and even that's vast, right? Many kilometers across. But that's 4% of it they've opened up. The rest of it's still to go if it continues. All right. That's a radically alienated relationship with the natural world in which you can look out on it and everything you see, every plant, every tree, every naturally occurring stream and body of water, every animal is overburden. It's just in the way of your economic project. What you see over the hill here in that slate quarry seems to me not the same thing at all. I think we can probably sustain stuff like that. And the marks of the older quarries around the dale suggest that there's a long history to this, that it has literally been sustained. Now, I'm hypothesizing here. Maybe someone locally can tell me different. Maybe that whole mine opened up a week ago. I don't know. That whole quarry. Let's hope not. All right, back to Wordsworth. I think when he's looking at the commons, when that's sort of part of the atmosphere behind those poems, he's really articulating a particular worldview in which economy and ecology are completely linked. That's what I think the commons was. That's why it was a sustainable, locally sustainable system for people to sustain themselves, right? To do their social reproduction, to reproduce themselves as beings. I need food, I need shelter, I need this amount of land to do that in, and this is how I derive all that. So what I love about those two words, economy and ecology, they both derive from the Greek word oikos, which gives us economy and ecology, which means home. It's a perfect Wordsworthian word to be here, home at Grasmere. But you see, that idea I think is dispersed in the poems and little fragments here and there, but it's everywhere I find the atmosphere of those poems. Even when he's simply noticing how beautiful it is, there's always this sort of economic economy underlying this, because we're talking about people who are shepherds in the mountains. This is how they are surviving materially in the world. Or small-scale local farmers. And these are the subjects of his poems. This is not simply nature in some sort of abstract, wild Canadian North sense of nature. Wordsworth nature is an area that people have been living in for thousands of years, and they're completely integrated into it, and they're living there. Again, to me, it still feels like that here. I don't know what it is, but you walk around, the little small-scale forestry going on the side of the lake, too. Which, again, I assume that's what that is. It must be, they must be working so carefully to sustain that. Mike, you couldn't do it otherwise. There's not a lot of trees here. If they took them all in Canada, those would be gone in a week, and they'd go on to the next valley. So that's the world Wordsworth was writing in. Is a world in which people were living in pretty careful balance with the carrying capacity of their local environment. And that's how that was their economic system. It couldn't stretch beyond that. And he seems very aware of that, and he enjoys that. He remarks upon it. He examines it to some extent. And I think, when Wordsworth is critical of the city or society, as it will sometimes be referred to, and that's opposed to the natural world, what I think he's critical of is our alienation, both from each other and from the natural world. And again, this seems a remarkable idea that we could still really use in today's world, is that he was very aware that those were connected. Those were a dual alienation. We were alienated both, and every time I think it's both, from nature and from each other. And those just go hand in hand. Again, thus, in a period of economic turmoil, Wordsworth's real empathy for displaced people, for vagrants and people whose livelihoods have been taken away for whatever reason. And he celebrated them as human beings and told their stories, however tragic or pathetic they may have been. But that's of a piece with, I think, what he's seeing in the landscape and in the way people are inhabiting a landscape. These things go ultimately together. Okay. I feel like I'm running around in circles. So when I went to the tar sands in northern Alberta a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, I knew I wanted to bring Wordsworth with me because I anticipated, and I knew from photographs and things like that, that this was going to be a place of this kind of radical alienation. Again, both from the natural world, in which we saw no connection with whatsoever, because it was completely being eradicated and removed, but also from lives of people. Because the other thing that's being removed in that part of the world are the indigenous people that have lived there for thousands and thousands of years, whose economy is entirely based upon what comes out of the land and ability to move freely on the land, because they were semi-nomadic, the people who live in the north. And the tar sands as a project was completely disrupting that. And in fact, it's doing it more simply than excluding them and removing them from the land, but it's through poisoning the land. There's a huge river, the Athabasca River, that goes right through the middle of the tar sands, and they just mine all around it. And then downstream, where the river goes, it goes into Lake Athabasca, a huge lake, and basically at the mouth of the river, there's a town, a small city called Fort Chipewyan. About 1,500 people or so, I think, live there. almost all Indigenous people. And they can no longer catch fish because the fish are all diseased and sick and deformed. And the government sends in scientists and has a look and go, oh, it's really not that bad. You can still drink the water. And then the city actually hires independent scientists who come in and go, oh my God, don't go anywhere near that water. You shouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. So there's a sort of ongoing argument. And the Canadian government has a terrible relationship to science. They've fired most scientists that work for the government. And the few they employ, I think, have gone through a very careful screening process. And they literally, in Canada, a scientist in the government's employment can't make a report without a minister signing off on it. They can't talk to the media. So that they can't say, I think there's something really bad here. There's the opportunity for the minister involved to cut that off and say, nope, you're not letting out that report. We don't want it to go public. So it's kind of a disaster at all levels. So I went up there, and of course, many of Wordsworth's poems are, the occasion for the poem is a walk of some kind, right? We're all familiar with these kinds of poems. Even the daffodil poem, going back to Dorothy's, to resurrect it for a minute from the flames I heartlessly threw it into. Even to resurrect that poem, it's Dorothy's journal of a time they walked along and saw the daffodils, and later Wordsworth looking at it. And so even that poem has a walk of some kind behind it. They seemingly almost all do. So I knew I was going on a walk, and it would be great to have Wordsworth along and think about walking and think about the kind of relationship to the natural world that he gave expression to, and what I was experiencing in northern Alberta, where nature is simply something to be removed, lock, stock, and barrel. Maybe what I'll do is read a small passage from that poem. Because I'm trying to think, where are we at timing-wise? Yeah, and then come around to being here again now. Does that sound all right? Because it would be good to get also to questions and discussion before the night is gone too long. I'll read a couple pages from this poem. So I wrote a poem called Reading Wordsworth in the Tar Sands. And we were there for several days, and we were camped. We pitched our tents beside a small lake, luckily upstream, not downstream, from the tar sands. It was actually an idyllic, beautiful spot. And so I wrote some of this there, wrote some of it subsequent to the walk as well. So I'm just going to jump in the middle of the poem. There's sort of an introductory part, and then I'll jump in and read a bit of this. So this is the second section of the poem. I'll read just a little bit of this. And there are little bits of primarily Homic Grasmere, sort of surface and then recede again, surface and recede again in this poem. The place from which I looked, the plain descending on Fort McMurray, or the road we walked, around the bounds of one dry lake. And if I thought of dying, of stone and tombs and pits, no profit, but one thought, the lot of others, could be mined. Yet, aerial, we might business halt, tempting notions. Wind over dead water. I thought of clouds where none lay, gray billows of moneyed dust, nickel and knot caught up in tracks of trucks, shadows, brittle butterflies, and the liquid crystal depths of dry grass. Benzene and naphthenic acid sands. Without restraints or bounds, blowing out and over this huge sand-ensnared world, the chemical truth extracts its word. It's simple, really. They tore the forest off fast, like a bandage over wounded earth, a blister in the sun, or a song without use value or intrinsic worth. Walking, we were seeing silvered shunts of sand lakes, like salt flats wondering what winkles out in yonder mercury sheen. No ponds pretend to lighten belief. Air cannon and scarecrow miners surround these tailings. Our desolations dream of crumbling decor. Whoever it was saw boreal, swept it clean in cold accounts before land wastes were fenced former forests of sand, thick dark thoughts leaching, heavy metal music machines, or death metal bands screaming unfathomable ruination inside a sealed steel Cuban space. Dear imagination, lighten up. Your part is human protest. But there are no visionary scenes of lofty beauties uplifting to see, no picturesque prospects, even if Bertinsky might shoot them from the air, chromatic as abstract patterns of chemical dirt, no matter. When in service of monetary gain and increasing industries of land liquidation, this world is anvil entertainment, bashed first people's flat land home, still springing up, thrust midst the fossilized dead of whose ancestral heat we strange grammar feed, as strange accumulations folk, pummel pores in veins of saturated soils, coiled up in the barrage we make making roads, the slow bombardment of never-ending development. That's all very depressing. I should note right there that there's a reference to, where to go, sound cannons and scarecrow miners. Where there is liquid in the tar sands, it's toxic. And a number of years ago, Greenpeace went in and pulled something like 3,000 dead water birds out of one lake. And it was a big news story in Canada. So the companies have since then put scarecrows in little tiny boats anchored out in the lakes, little orange men like this. And they have air cannons all around the outside of the lakes. So every few seconds you hear this sort of loud, deep boom. And it's an air cannon going off to scare birds away. And there are no birds in tar sands. It's kind of remarkable to be in a place where there simply are no birds in the air at all. Just nothing. And it smells a little bit like gas in the air. This is a very long poem, and that's sort of that part of the poem. There's a short sort of introduction before that, and that's the first part where the poem is trying to ease itself into this very damaged, broken place in kind of damaged, broken language as it approaches it. I'm trying to write a paired poem to this. So I wrote a poem thinking about Wordsworth in northern Alberta and the tar sands. Now I'm here exactly a year later in Wordsworth land. So what I'm working on while I'm here is writing a second poem that picks up this story again, but with maybe a little bit more hope. I find this a hopeful place. Maybe I'm a dreaming tourist, I'm not sure. But like I was sort of gesturing at ignorantly earlier, there seem to be things that the ecology, I'm looking up at the map for what I'm looking up. I'm looking at Grassmere up there on the wall. There are aspects to this place that suggest there's still an effort to find a way of sustaining it. Because it's a pretty sparse place. If you look up on those bare hills, this is a place that probably can't sustain a lot anyhow. I think there are many generations of figuring out probably the limits of what you can and can't do in a place like this. If you wind up in a vast place like Canada, we've had a couple centuries now of people not really caring about limits because there doesn't seem to be any, but they're finding them. Finally, we're finding those limits in this era, I think. So the poem I'm trying to write while I'm here is right now called Home at Grassmere, which is maybe a bit cheeky, but I'm trying to rethink those carbon fuel problems of our way of relating to the planet. We're all, I'm sure, very well aware of how dire most scientists say the situation is with our carbon, with our fossil fuel addiction, and to the point where geologists are now referring to this as the Anthropocene, a new geological era in which human activity is now impacting the entire planet, every aspect of it. I think it's important to think, sometimes we think climate change, we think global warming, we think it's something purely in the atmosphere. But it really is a geophysical phenomenon that is receding ice caps. Sometimes I can't find the easiest words. Rising ocean levels, thawing permafrost, the release of methane. All these things are geophysical. They're not simply of the air. They're of the land and the sea as well. The changes that are happening. Okay. So to come into a place like this and try and re-engage with some of those issues. So I thought I would just read again one short passage from this poem, and then maybe we can have some discussion if people have something to say. So it's always probably a stupid thing to do, to read a poem. You're in the midst of writing. And it's still half written in journals, and I've typed out a few passages that feel like, oh yeah, that's going to be a part of it. So this part I'm going to read was written 2 days ago, probably. I think it's 2 days ago. When I arrived, I got here in the afternoon, and I just sat down in the sort of the vegetable garden beside Dove Cottage right there, because that seemed the most publicly accessible part of it. I hadn't gone and talked to Jeff or seen anybody that works here yet, so I just sat there and wrote the first thing that came to mind without thinking I'm writing anything really that I'll use, and that's probably the best way to write. And then as I looked back, I thought, oh yeah, I think this is part of the poem I'm coming here to write, actually. So I'll read this short passage of this, and then I'll take a break here and we can talk. It sort of starts in medias res because it's picking up on one other small part of the poem that will come before this. I guess I still don't know. Go on, leave the city, fly to England and Grasmere. The poem going on past its own safe boundaries, the small concave of one page and one veil. We cannot retreat or retire to when the air itself is burning away. There isn't invocation enough. Herbs and vegetables in Wordsworth's garden, rhubarb and foxglove and nettle. The greeting of rock and oak by the lake. There is no way to begin. Slate and nasturtium, the lumpy white walls of Dove Cottage, nails and wires dangling, clematis and wild rose. So the senses fill with a verse that's been rushing towards this small place since the universe began, and it will shoot right past us, go through an opening in the mountains, crack in the clouds, speed off to where the light passes into the collapse of all things, and I will not catch one word of it. I will hang out at the picturesque BP station in Ambleside, smelling the petrol and converting the price of junk food from pounds to dollars, watching the traffic back up along the Rydal Road. I will consider the presence or absence, or more likely present absence, of shales under the earth, the barbecue smell of the coal burning in Dove Cottage, and the gas that undergirds even this pleasant absence, which is a seeming of independent rocks and waters, lack of work or need, the shuttling between the how we make our living and the where we make our living. And it goes on from there. So yay, Dove Cottage. Love it. So thank you very much. I would love it if you have any questions or comments or anything to add at all. So we have a little bit of time, right, to discuss a bit. Yeah, absolutely. Yes?
What do you think Wordsworth would have made today, the man's predicament?
That's a great question, isn't it? I think he would be disgusted. He was a man of pretty strong opinions when he felt them. And you get that sense that as life went on for him, that he tried to bury some of those strong opinions. So there's a famous story, like I'm trying to think what the story is, where he's visiting some lord or another who says something politically that Wordsworth doesn't agree with, and he says, scratch my surface and you'll still see a Democrat underneath, or something like that, he says. So I think you could prod him and push him, and he would get quite upset and opinionated about things. So I think he would be quite shocked, but also quite happy that he was safely ensconced here in Grasmere, which I assume he would be. Probably couldn't pry him out, or at least around the corner anyway, right?
But he did withdraw to Grasmere, didn't he?
Yeah, exactly. It's a kind of withdrawal.
You're challenging whether you can.
Yeah, exactly. Because I don't think that's one difference I think between his world and ours. Is you probably still could withdraw. Certainly, you could live out your own life in seclusion if you were privileged enough to create those circumstances. It's very hard to do now, I think.
Can't help wondering whether his opposition to the extension of the railway up into the Lake District was NIMBYism or his desire to protect nature. I don't know if you've looked any more closely.
A little bit. Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? And I think sometimes that's a very hard line to draw. And sometimes what seems NIMBYism actually has a bigger picture. Or maybe it's just my desire to be able to piggyback on NIMBYism to a better world. Certainly in Vancouver, where a pipeline has been planned from the Alberta Tar Sands all the way to the ocean or harbor. And there is an existing one, but it's very old and very small, and probably not very safe anymore. They want to replace it with a very large new one. And there's a lot of opposition. A lot of that opposition is very NIMBYistic because it cuts through a neighborhood and through the side of a park. And so the local community, residents, are up in arms about it. But that's all right. We need that too.
Yes.
We need that perspective as well.
What's the tar sand industry? Is that a national industry there in Canada?
No.
Or is it a private company?
It's totally international. Basically, every oil company in the world is invested in the tar sands in one way or another, either as a direct producer, as the person that provides the piping side of it, the transportation side of it. They all piggyback on each other, and as a new mine site opens within it, you'll have sometimes 2, 3, 4, 5 of these huge corporations all in on it as partners.
So there's the usual suspects like BP.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. BP, Shell, Exxon, you name it. Yeah. There are 2 Canadian companies, and our government acts like, oh yeah, it's a Canadian project, it's good for our nation, but they're actually bit players when you look at the whole big picture. And the 2 state-owned Chinese oil companies are very heavily invested in as well. Yeah.
So when Wordsworth in 1810
Yeah.
calls for the Lake District to be sort of national property,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a lot of discussion about this we could have. But I mean, is he talking about a Lake District that is largely common land? Is he talking to, if you like, the populace, as it were, or is he talking at this point to a relatively few landowners?
I'm fascinated by that moment too, absolutely fascinated, because as far as I can tell, that concept didn't seem to exist, the concept of a national park. There were no national parks when Wordsworth says that. So it's almost like he's inventing the concept. And to me, it's always been that's sort of a step from the idea of the commons to the idea of a national park, is sort of as how he's getting there, it seems to me. Because he looks at the Lake District, in which there always has been a lot of common land. And I love it on my ordnance survey map, that just up here, it says in huge letters on the map, so Grasmere Common, on top of the fells and things up there. And so I think that's what the transition is for him, is to scale up that idea. So what is a common, this place that because it's not about ownership necessarily, it's about access and use, right? That's what a common was for. In fact, they were almost always owned by someone, the government or a lord or somebody.
But he qualifies it, doesn't he, by saying that those who might Stephen Hawking
Yes,
enjoy.
this-
So it's a bit common, but it's not quite common.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
not for every.
And there's that tension I find so fascinating, again, because you're right, it starts with this idea of national property that everyone should have access to, he says, as long as you, because
As long as you qualify.
as long as you qualify by having the right taste, right?
Yeah. You gotta be
Which
the right
suddenly, sounds like it requires education. It requires a certain aesthetic sensibility to really appreciate it. And the worst thing would be, and here's the railroad again thing too, ignorant tourists tramping around will be the worst thing to have happen.
So how do we square that with the Democrat?
Yeah, well, he's completely fluid, right? I mean, as any person I think would have to be, right? To conceive of him as a realistic human being. As Walt Whitman said, as Walt Whitman said, do I contradict myself? Yeah, I contain multitudes. Of course I contradict myself. There's this wonderful, I think, Wordsworth, and I've taught a course before where we go from Wordsworth to Whitman, because I mostly teach American and Canadian literature. And I think there's actually wonderful bridges to be built between those two authors, those two poets. So I think he is contradicting, and I find it's those moments when it's really revealed that I find really rich and interesting. So I think in the poem Home at Grasmere, and I think in that statement like that, and that crazy letter to Beaumont, where he's sort of tentatively going, oh, wow, I don't really know you, and you just gave me land, and I guess I kind of want patrons, but this is my first experience of that, and not quite sure what I'm supposed to do or say when you just gave me this place. Does anyone know, did he ever even go there and do anything? There's a little cottage there, right? And did he retain possession of it through the years, and but not really do anything? Do you know?
I think he rented it out,
Yeah, probably. That'd be smart.
He rented the other bit as well, didn't he? He had.
Huh. Really
Because
interesting.
the beauty would be it gave him a boat. If you own a property,
Really?
of course, you got
Of
a boat.
course.
So it's useful for that.
Oh wow. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yes.
I was thinking about your poetry about the tar sands. What place or power do you think that poetry has in getting the message heard?
Yeah. That's right.
Who
Because
listens to it, and in what way does it have an impact that journalism doesn't? Or
right? We have this idea of political poetry, that term gets used, but then you have to stop and think and go, well, what does that really mean? What is political poetry doing? Because if your idea is that political poetry's task is to raise consciousness, right? To get a message out. We often think of politics and art this way. Got to get the message out. Poetry's the worst thing you could do. I mean, for God's sakes, write a rock song, or there's all sorts of things you could do that poetry's not going to accomplish. But I definitely occupy a world in which those tensions are going on. So when I was in the tar sands, and people organizing said, "So what's your story?" And because I had to fill out like a questionnaire ahead of time, and I said, "Well, I'm a writer, and I'm going to be writing about being there." And so they lumped me in with the media. So we had a media meeting, and so we went around in a circle. What's everybody doing? And there are all these journalists who work for different, mostly fairly independent, kind of media outlets who were all writing articles. And came around to me, and I'm writing a poem. But that poem, not maybe that part I was reading from, just to give a sampling of it, but there is a level of reportage in that poem where it's trying to convey a sense of what it smells, feels, tastes like, what it does to you cognitively to be in a place like that, where you can literally smell oil in the air, gas in the air. It smells like a gas station in the air all the time. Because literally, they're opening up bitumen to the air, like digging it up, and it's literally just a congealed form of oil lying on the ground everywhere and being scooped up and dumped in dump trucks and carried along. And so you can literally, the air smells like it. On the other hand, another experience I've just had, because in part to do with this pipeline being built in Burnaby, I was sued by the U.S. oil company for $5.6 million this past fall. Because I did a bad thing, I did interviews with media and voiced my opinion that I didn't think this was a good idea. So I was sued, and they said that I was conspiring to encourage people to block their pipeline project, and therefore cost them money, and therefore I was liable for the $5.6 million they figured that they could hypothetically lose, or something. I'm not quite sure how that works. And then in court, so there's a little, it's not a trial, what would you call it, a hearing in court. Their lawyer, in presenting their case, read from my writing. And it was mostly prose writing, but the lawyer called it a poem. And because what had happened, people had gone and built a blockade over the area they wanted to. They had identified a spot they wanted to do seismic testing, where they would drill down and see is it seismically stable to put a pipeline underground here. So people built a blockade on top of that marked site where they were going to drill, and sort of camped out there. And like Paris in the 19th century, they just grabbed whatever was lying around and built a wall so no one could get in there. So in court, the lawyer reading this writing of mine said, quote, underneath the poetry, you see how the barricade was built, a description of how the barricade was built, which is just a wonderful line for a lawyer to give you, to donate to a poet. It's like, I think I can work with that. So, part of my experience of that was, well, maybe poetry did matter, because they saw it as something you would bring up in court as evidence. They saw it as something significant. Of course, the media then picked up on this. So I think, like anything, it becomes socially or politically relevant in certain circumstances. Right place at right time, as it were. So poets could write quietly away in their cottage by the lake for forever, and no one might notice it. It might not have a political impact. But if there are certain circumstances in which that poetry starts to circulate and connect to those circumstances, then I think it can really matter. And I think that's to some extent happens with Wordsworth too. That it's not that he was hiding in a cottage writing the whole time, but that maybe later on, later in his life or after his life even, but those poems and some of those ideas started to matter in other political situations. Now, no one's picked up, I don't think, a Wordsworth line quite this way, but the way Shelley's Rise Like Lions still exists very actively in the world, and you could be in Brazil and someone might read that poem at a rally You can be anywhere, and that poem still has real teeth in the world, which is interesting. And I think there are parts of Wordsworth they'd be a little more cerebral. There aren't too many sort of slogans you could put on a placard in Wordsworth, but he comes close. I think he comes close.
I mean, that sense of getting a voice, a kind of cultural voice
Yes.
about this. I mean, is there a kind of broader artistic response or movement around this issue in Canada?
Yes.
That you're feeling you're part of.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, it's more than Canada is what I want to say. It's definitely global, as it needs to be, I think.
What about Ed Bertinsky's?
Yes.
You mentioned him in the Pound Day. His photographs.
Yeah, he denies.
What do you think of them?
Well,
because they're beautiful, aren't they?
they're beautiful, and that's part of the problem, maybe.
I know.
They're too beautiful, and they sell now for hundreds of thousands of dollars to galleries. And he sort of, even though he will say critical things about the tar sands development, he has his own critical reading of it. He nevertheless says he doesn't see it as his job to be a political evangelist for the environmental movement or to be a public critic of it in some way.
That's quite clever, surely, isn't it?
Exactly.
He distanced himself from that and let other people make their own right-minded opinion of what it's all about.
Yeah, that's right.
And there is kind of some horrific beauty in the scale.
There is. And I find that a fascinating problem to consider too, which I try to consider that a bit in the poetry too, of the still in this realm of noticing the beauty of the world, even when the beauty is something that's absolutely horrific. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, there is a wider movement afoot, absolutely. In Canada, it's really anchored around Indigenous people's rights, especially because the further west you go, so in British Columbia, it's almost all what's referred to as unceded land. That is, there was never a historical treaty signed between Indigenous people and colonizing power. And the Supreme Court of Canada recognizes what they call Aboriginal Title. That's literally legally owned by Indigenous people, not by Canada, the sort of western quarter of Canada. The government completely ignores that fact, ignores the Supreme Court. So what it takes then is for someone with enough resources to sue the government of Canada and take them to the Supreme Court and say, you're infringing Aboriginal title. But that costs millions of dollars, right? Because the government will have all sorts of lawyers and will tie that up in courts for a very long time, and it will cost you so much money to do that. But it is happening. There are I think, 2 cases right now that different Indigenous groups are bringing to the Supreme Court saying, hold on a sec, this is the definition by the Supreme Court says, and it's actually marvelous because it evokes the commons again. So the Supreme Court of Canada say Aboriginal title is collective title, and it's a title that assumes that land cannot be encumbered, it says, in such a way that damages people's access to or use of it in the future. So it incorporates its future existence into its present definition, and says it has to be sustained. And that's based on how Aboriginal people lived on the land, which is fascinating. So if you go, this can't be encumbered in a way that damages someone's future use of it, well, let's imagine that's a mountain that a mining company has discovered this copper under, and what they do these days is remove the mountain, right? To drill a hole in it, now you take the mountain off and grind it all up, soak it with arsenic and other chemicals that then release, that separate the ore. It's an absolutely devastating thing that they do. Well, that doesn't work because that then takes the future use of that mountain away. And this is literally what they're talking about, because mountains are very significant because, well, we gather a certain kind of wild fruit at a certain time of the year. We hunt this animal. I saw a deer today. Just hanging up silver how. A stag had a beautiful antlers and just a wonderful, bright reddish brown color. It was just gorgeous. Really nice. Anyway, sorry. Excited about that. Anyhow, we could go on, but in Canada, it's really centering around Aboriginal struggles. Yeah.
I find this matter of, where you give the example of yourself being sued by big corporations, I find this absolutely horrific, and it seems to me that it's getting worse and worse. I mean, this transatlantic trading agreement that
Yes, exactly.
US and I think Canada may be
Yep.
involved.
They are. Yeah.
You know, we're just being ripped off from start to finish.
Yeah. And the real worry with that is that it can be used. So right now, let's say in Canada or any member country, that there's a law within that country. It's the law of the land. Well, this higher level can then say, yeah, but that law, which is protecting, say, your water supply, is in the way of our global corporations' need to mine there. Therefore, we're going to have to overrule your local law. And tough luck if that means you no longer have water to drink. It's just mind-boggling.
Oregon is suing people at the moment for collecting rain off rooftops.
Yeah. Isn't that crazy?
It's supposed to not be incumbent on its way to a water source so they can then use it for their own. So they're suing householders for collecting rain.
It's just crazy.
So that it can then be bottled and sold as 1,000 times.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Well, and notoriously Nestle in California is sucking up water like crazy in the middle of one of the worst droughts ever.
For a cent for 50 gallons.
Yeah.
So whereabouts was that?
Well, Oregon is where they're suing people for collecting rainwater off their own houses during droughts, and then Nestle paying, I think it's a cent for 40 gallons.
That's right.
I think one of the reasons, or one of the ways in which poets do succeed is by throwing up interesting images, or sometimes telling phrases. And the bit that resonated for me before was your talking about the birds, not on the tar sands.
Right.
And it resonated particularly for me because we have a similar instance here.
Really?
You're in the nice little oasis of Grasmere,
Yeah.
but to the south of us we've got Lancashire thinking of fracking all over the place. A very small area compared with the tar sands.
Yeah.
It'll be greatly affected.
Yeah.
But to the west we've got Sellafield. And
What's
within
that?
Sellafield is I think it was the first atomic power station.
Oh, right, yeah.
And now largely a ruin. And it includes two buildings particularly, one of which contains pools in which all sorts of atomic rubbish has been thrown.
That's right.
And the birds that fly in and land on it have to be culled.
Oh, wow.
And
that's amazing.
I learned this story from an artist who had made a really beautiful collage which related to that.
Right.
And suddenly the whole thing came out.
Yeah.
People don't want to know that story.
Sure.
But the moment a writer or an artist tells it, it becomes interesting.
Yeah. So where is that? That's on the west of the on the water?
30 miles away from us.
Wow.
But also a big site
Amazing.
of tourism as well. That there's people who want to go, not just artists and writers and stuff, who want to go and look at that. But there's also this weird kind of post-industrial tourism.
Really? Yeah.
Well.
Crazy. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I've been thinking about the birds a lot for a number of reasons. In Kent, when we were walking, we had a naturalist with us, and we'd stop every few minutes and listen. He'd identify what we're hearing, which is wonderful. What are are they ravens, the blackbirds you have here with the graying? What are they called? Jackdaws. Those are jackdaws. Oh, what a noise they make. That's incredible. Okay.
It's
a jackdaw.
in favour of jackdaws.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's not fair, Jeff. That's not fair. They're very entertaining. They're very clever.
Yes, I know.
In Home and Grasmere, those great descriptions of the birds circling overhead, right? And it becomes this sort of, it's a real image that he works on and fashions of multiplicity, of sharing the air, of not being able to possess the air, he says. It's this real dreamy sense of that mirror image of him on the land, finding his home, and this other collective amorphous thing above him that he sees in the birds. It's just beautiful.
Have you encountered the ones that come over rather rapidly every so often, making a loud noise?
I did encounter those today, and I was very curious about that. What on earth is that? What's going on? I mean, I know what they were, but why are they here? Is there a base close by?
No flying practice.
Yeah, they were right in the valley. I was above them almost where I was when I saw them. And deafening. And so where are they flying out of? Where are those planes based?
Probably from Marham down in Norfolk.
Really?
But from other places as well.
So they go find like valleys and mountains to practice there. How pleasant.
Yeah, I used to live in East Anglia. I didn't realise I came all the way.
Yeah.
Kate Davis, who was the last contemporary artist in residence here, when she was living here, her boyfriend was living in Edinburgh, and they used to time them. So she used to text him and say, "It's past," and he used to time it coming through. So it'd be 3 minutes from
They were going incredibly fast, weren't they?
Well,
Yeah.
we remember when they built the new library, there was a big red crane. We were told that was a sort of one of their navigation points.
You're kidding.
Crane of our library, you turn right at the crane.
Is this a daily occurrence? Because I did hear them another day since I've been here. Every day.
Fine days.
You know it's a fine
Right,
day
right.
before you've woken up in the morning because you hear them go over like first thing in the morning as soon as the sun's up.
They don't fly weekends.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sorry, this is going to find its way into a poem, I think. 'Cause it's kind of fascinating. Because of the contrast, right?
Yeah.
Just unbelievable.
Neil Ronaldson, who was president residence here a few years ago, has one about being up on the fell and looking down into the cockpit
Yeah,
and being able to like look
Really?
down onto the
incredible.
planet.
Yeah.
Russian.
Very brief. That's amazing. Wow.
Well, we probably should.
Was there another comment? I think you had, but maybe the moment's gone. Yeah, exactly.
Anybody else got any final thoughts?
What was the outcome of your hearing?
They dropped it. That's why I'm smiling and can refer to it casually. Otherwise, I would still be very stressed out. Yeah, I know. That's right. Yeah.
Did
Yeah,
they
luckily.
tell them that like trying to sue a poet for $5 million is not really going to get very far anyway?
Well, it was a real PR bungle, I think, because the media loved it. I was getting questions like, "So what rhymes with climate change?" And the media thought, this must involve somehow